Kind of winging.
Bringing it.
Right.
Are you starting this or me? What's going on? You doing it?
No, hang on. Sorry.
You froze.
Sorry. Anyway. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another E5 podcast. My name is Paul Mean, and thank you very much for watching and joining us. And I am joined, as ever, by my beautiful and competent tag team partners. Introduce yourself, chaps.
Hello, I'm JW.
And it's Dave Watts here, aka Sparking Ninja.
John the Wise Ward and David the Ninja Watts. Lads, we have... Interestingly, since we started doing these, we've been getting messages on Instagram, which is very lovely. And thank you very much for all the lovely messages on Instagram as a forum and also in the YouTube comment section. We've been getting some really nice messages and some kind of requests, I suppose. And also I put a message out saying, look, if there's anything people were more interested in, because, again, being honest and transparent, some of the stuff that we are researching is really, really, really quite heavy and taking us a lot longer to do. So we thought we'd maybe do some of the quick wins and stuff.
Well, that's the key. I mean, a lot of the things that we feel like we have to do takes an awful lot of effort and time, and we can't rush that. But you know, it's nice. It's nice to have some quick fire kind of things that we can just chew on for a quick 20-minute chat, really.
Yeah, and also thank you to everyone who watched the first edition webinar. We had some really nice feedback, positive feedback on that. And yes, we do enjoy doing this because we're all the same level of bonkers as a group of pals. So yeah, I think once we've got everything out of the way for this year and early next year, maybe next summer, it might be worthwhile looking back at past editions and doing some specific webinars on a second and third, but not the whole thing because they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and that would just never end. Today's podcast, I'm going to challenge you all: temporary or permanent? Let's try and define and discuss temporary or permanent electrical installations. I personally, and it's my personal opinion as always, I absolutely hate the definition, the word temporary being used, because as we all know, we'll go and see some horror shows lashed up, and everyone will go, yeah, it's all right, mate, it's just temporary.
Yeah, well, temporary seems to excuse effort, doesn't it?
Well, the thing is, if I saw, and this is just my opinion before I ask John the definition of it, if I saw temporary and I knew the person had control of the electrical installation, I probably wouldn't have a problem as long as those fundamental principles of, locking it away in cupboards, barriers, enclosures, overcurrent protection was still in place, cables were sized accordingly, and all that good stuff. It may not look pretty, but if the installation is under control, under maintenance, and it's a very short duration, then I might not object. But this kind of brings us on to, weirdly enough, our previous webinars about the past. Look back. John, do you want to tell us a little bit about temporary electrical installations?
Yeah, temporary installations showed up in the 10th edition of the wiring regulations, which came out in 1934. And
great decade.
There was a fairly short section in there. It's actually only 7 actual paragraphs of text in there. And the main definition of that one, which, let's read this bit here, it says, every temporary installation, whether for lighting, heating or power, shall, if intended to be in service for a longer period than 3 months, comply in all respects with the requirements of a permanent installation. And if it's a shorter period than 3 months, or if not completely overhauled in that period, special care should be taken to ensure that it's in accordance with the requirements of a whole load of stuff. So 3 months is the sort of cut-off point, and that was, say, from 1934.
Oh, that's lovely. Special care.
Yeah, I guess the key thing is
training for that?
You had the rules at the time, and if you don't need to go into the depth of the rules because it's only up to 3 months, they basically say, well, whoever the authority is, whoever the local authority is or insurance providers are, satisfy them. It's pretty much where that goes, because there wasn't any other. We didn't have guidance notes then. I don't think we had any technical publications that supported these rules. We may have had maybe a couple of little like books that you can source from the 60s, which maybe there's some temporary stuff in those. That'd be interesting to look for.
It's I'd love to know what special care meant in them days. It's not one of those old wordisms of special care. That to me, in modern terms, and tell me if I'm wrong here, chaps, would be the installation should be under a maintenance regime.
Yeah, well, there's a nice bit further on, which is probably the best bit of the whole lot of this. It says, every temporary installation, which is not in addition to a permanent installation in a private dwelling house, shall be in the charge of a competent person who shall accept full responsibility for the installation, for its use, and for any alteration or extension, and the name and designation of such person shall be prominently displayed in the vicinity of the main controlling device. So you've got to put your name on the wall next to the switch, saying this is the person who's dealing with it.
So this installation belongs to me.
Can we write to the IET and just say, please bring that back? Just put it back in. Do you know what the best thing is? Is when the Amendment 3 or 19th edition DPC comes out, we should go through the old past editions and re-quote it back to them and say, please change it to this. Please note this used to be in your rigs book. It would be hysterical for them
to
words
see. Like perfect in there and stuff.
Yeah, we should, absolutely. I find so for those listening or watching, temporary under Collins dictionary definition is something that is temporary, that lasts only for a limited time, not clearly defined. And an installation under the dictionary definition, because it's sat in front of me, is where is it? Sorry, I'm going bonkers here. So the definition of installation is the installation of a piece of equipment you fit or put somewhere that is ready to be used. So not really much joy there, because nobody wants to put definitions in anymore. And when you look at the requirements or the definition of a temporary installation, it doesn't really define it. Thank you, Collins Dictionary. So nobody wants to define it because there's a cost associated. And what you'll find in most, if you're a learner or a trainee, or you've been in this industry 20, 30 years, is sometimes there are conversations that people really don't want to have, because the minute you open your gob, it's going to cost someone money somewhere. I see that as not a threat to an electrical contractor or an electrician. I see it as an opportunity to earn money and do things properly, which is why when people say to me, and anybody who's ever worked with me, when they say it's temporary, I immediately just frown and say, please don't use that word with me, unless we completely understand the context and the risks associated with the words temporary installation and the safety implications. Then we may have a big problem, or we may be just accepting and normalizing a bad behavior. Now, for electricians, if we look in, is it 110 something or another, the list of installations, there's a section in the regs that talks about other standards to read, which, Dave, do you want to introduce us to?
Gosh, yes, I think I've got the regs right in front of me.
Okay, 110.1.3.
Yeah.
It includes other standards, which we will cover in other podcasts, no doubt, or webinars.
And remember that, I mean, that list of other standards, it says such cases include the following. So, you know, many other standards could be applicable for the requirements of 7671.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's got emergency lighting, it's got fire alarms, telecommunication systems, and it's got temporary electrical systems, but this is obviously for events, entertainment and related purposes. That's the 7909 that I'm familiar with, you know. But I mean, any kind of other, I mean, there's the other standard for construction sites, which I don't know if it's carrying on and being extended, 7375, but there are many other standards that will help you create safe temporary installations, and they're all built on the same kind of principles with temporary, that anything that is installed temporarily should mostly be pre-tested construction. So if you're going to do an installation where you're going to take cable off of a reel, you're going to select a protected device, you're going to put in an accessory, and you're going to say, oh, it's a temporary, all the guidance might recognize it as temporary. You'd have to then commission it and sign it as if it's to 7671. And even you know, 7909 will push that. You can only consider it as a temporary installation if you're using pre-tested assemblies, pre-tested extension leads, pre-tested distribution units. So they're tested off site and then you quickly assemble them. And the point of that pre-testing is the verification is minimized, but it's still temporary.
So you're pre-tested off site, assembled on site, and then your verification is minimal.
If if you have to do anything on site, such as reeling off a drum, taking off a plug, rechecking, reconnecting, anything like that, even if it's passing like a Soccerpex through a small hole to then re-terminate it, it's not pre-tested anymore.
Is that why when you go onto event sites, I was at one this weekend, where they've got coils and coils and coils of like 16 amp commando sockets and stuff, because it's pre-tested and assembled, and then they just coil it up, plug it into the disto, and
well, yeah, I mean, obviously the problem with this is because you've got pre-tested, you'll have pre-tested length, so you'll have buckets or crates of distro systems, 5 meters, 10 meters. But if you only store such short lengths, you're going to end up having so many. So what they'll do is you'll often find when your length of a run with temporary isn't too long, you may find coils of stuff left over. It's another part of the verification is to make sure that you're laying them out properly. You know, instead of coiling, you're laying them out. Even when we do large single core conductors and we have any slack, we don't just coil them up near the generator. We do a nice little layout. Sometimes it takes up physical space, but then so be it.
I think the events organizer that I went to this weekend didn't get the memo on don't coil stuff, because it was literally just like coils everywhere. That was insane. So on 110.3, interestingly enough, you look at these standards. The first time I read this, I went, I'm never going to read these standards. Now I look back at this list and I go, I've read all of them. Pretty much read them all now.
Yeah, and more.
And the thing is that the one at the bottom, like 10, life safety and firefighting, BS 9999, thanks to Dan, obviously, and his innate knowledge of it, we've got to know well. But even little ones like 8519, which talks about double unistrutting, double bolting unistrut threads for fire prevention collapse. Stuff like that. Little gold nuggets. It's on our Instagram account. I put a clip of it. But there's some really good gems of knowledge about fire survival of cable and all that, and the right application. It's a real shame there isn't more put into this, because to be honest with you, I know I'm going to get shot for saying this. I'd rather this reg book be twice the size with more information than not. If that makes any sense.
Yeah,
at least they give installers more of an option.
And it most likely will save you more money in the long run, instead of having to invest in separate published British standards.
Yeah, I've always looked at this as a choose your own adventure type shenanigans. If anybody remembers those books where you jumped around.
Yeah, so you've got 3 months, and how old is that? That is from when?
That first appeared in 1939.
Right.
So
obviously,
old.
that's at some point disappeared, hasn't it? Over.
Yeah, it's sort of it's still mentioned, but it's sort of like everything else, it's changed and altered over the years and has ended up in something completely different. But,
probably because the owners of the houses didn't want a label that said this installation is under the control of John Ward, who's currently living in the basement and won't leave. This is very strange.
But the funny thing is, I charge money and I get paid a lot of money to go to companies to consult, to create things like duty holder procedures, roles, responsibilities, where the end outcome is really to know who is in control, to know who is that person in control of the installation, who is the responsible person. And it seems like back then it was a lot more evident as to what people needed. They needed to know who was competent, who was named, who was in charge. Yeah.
Can I suggest something here? I think the stuff we're talking about is going against the grain of what everybody else thinks and does. And it's not a deliberate act. It's just that we know that, the legislation, the duties imposed upon people require you to own, control, manage, correctly select and erect, and all the rest of it, because if you ever end up in front of the guy with the curly wig, there will be the questions asked. Who was responsible? Who was accountable? Who controlled? Who authorized? So don't think we're just saying this for the sake of saying it. We're genuinely, these are words and terms that we're trying to get into the hearts and minds of people more, so that they can ask themselves that question, and then that allows it. It's going to sound weird. It's that inner voice, isn't it? If you reprogram your inner voice to ask you an objective question, it's almost like a peer asking you a question. Do you know what I mean? Are you sure that's fine? Is that temporary a lash up, or is it a temporary permanent, or is it a temporary for a? I have always in my career, I've always defined 3 months as anything below 3 months is temporary. If it's over 3 months, I have defined it as a permanent installation with a fixed duration.
Yeah.
Basically. And that duration may be unknown, but the level of quality and control cannot differ. Most sites get away with just the 110 volt center tapped earth transformer, run a load of festoons on the other side of a hoarding, and then they say they have control in the installation because they have obviously a flex cable, which people are briefed on. Don't touch the cables, don't put your shovels through. They put a relative level of height, they're clip direct, it's a relatively low voltage. And that's covered in that BS 7375. Well, it was covered in it, but it's now withdrawn as far as I'm aware. And I think I know why it was withdrawn, because it required insulation monitoring devices and all sorts of shenanigans. So there used to be a British standard called electrical installations in construction sites. But I don't think you can even get it anymore. It hasn't been updated in donkeys. I think the last time I checked the system, it was withdrawn on one of the BSI websites. Said it was withdrawn, but I'm sure you can check. Now, BS 7909, obviously we're not going to cover just BS 7909, but the one thing that is quite interesting is the title of it is Temporary Electrical Systems for Events, Entertainment and Related Purposes. Is related purposes defined anywhere? What can you tell us about it, Dave?
That's probably just an open-ended point.
It's too open-ended.
It's like, take for example, I mean, I've got an opinion, and one of the guys in the IAT who's probably one of the good authors of information, James, agrees with me on this. Things like right now, this time of year is perfect. Christmas tree decorations and displays. You've got a shop who's deciding right now to erect a display of Christmas ornaments to then open the site, let the public occupy that little grotto area. Yeah. A lot of that will be coils of extension leads dangling down from above with like basically extension strips for all the different lighting arrangements that are being plugged in. And that's going to be long lengths. Now, RCDs is our get out of jail card for this, but that doesn't help us with things like short circuit currents, you see. And I've done a hashtag over the past few years. I think it was called festive floors or something. I don't know. I have to look. Yeah, because a lot of these displays will have, I mean, some will just be extension leads, just daisy chained. Some will actually be kind of just DIY by the guy on site who isn't a qualified electrician. You know, I remember, again, I put the pictures on Twitter a couple of years ago. There was like 6 foot tall Santa, and you press his foot, he'd do a little song. He was plugged into a cable that was dangling from above with a metal clad socket. And there's about 4 or 5 inches of brown, blue, green, and yellow outside the metal clad socket, just hanging from it. You know, these are, again, this is a temporary installation that has been installed, and the public are occupying the place that this event is going on. Yeah, much like where you've been over the weekend, Paul. It's a temporary installation, and the public are occupying the premises. So this is where 7909 as a scope, you can look at temporary installations in this kind of nature. If you're going to open it up, you can let the public in, these kind of things. Also, some workplaces, you know, if the persons occupying aren't, you know, if we were to define them as ordinary persons, then you've got to kind of consider them to be also effectively under the same kind of risk as public. That's kind of related, it's open-ended for us to properly interpret the risk. But that's where it's aimed at. It's aimed at, you know, you may just assume it to be sports events, like where, you know, like I did a lot of work with. You may think it to be things like theaters and film sets, but it's also the Christmas displays. It's also the small setups you may get in a town for the, you know, the public to go around, even if it's a temporary installation, for a shop, maybe even, you know, in a little street market, you know, a village fete or whatever. The standards, again, it doesn't define 3 months. It's kind of just says make sure it's suitable for the duration. Everything should be pre-tested. If anything's being made up for it, we then go to 7671 from the perspective of initial verification with the full, the full checks, all the tests. We don't just think because of its shorter duration that we apply less of a professional level of installation.
So I've got a question for you then.
Yeah.
So 7909, obviously, yeah, it's got its quirks. Is it really sad of me that minute you said about the 3 or 4 inches before I get onto that of the inner core showing, I immediately thought 526.6 breach. There's mechanical strain on conductors.
Well, yeah, and don't forget that. Don't forget, as it says in 7671, and I'll just define it. I'll just repeat it. The regulations are intended to apply to installations generally. In certain cases, they may need to be supplemented by others. So all of these installations comply with 7671 first as your foundation. So you're right, Paul, in that you would look at that as well. You'd always look at 7671.
This is one of the
So
biggest.
You can't just work to one supplemented standard. You work to 7671 and the others.
Excuse me. This is one of the issues I have when I speak to contractors. Is when contractors come up to me and they'll say, we work to 7671. And I'm like, oh, okay. So then you immediately start circumnavigating and go, what other standards do you work from? And immediately you can gauge contractors and their competency and their quality very, very quickly now.
Yeah.
And you're going to get that, obviously, if you're a business development manager and stuff, you're going to get them, they're a bit rusty and not technical anymore. I get that. But when you get into the meat of talking to contractors, as I do get into talking with contractors, you can soon gauge their competency and their approach. And there are too many contractors who have been brainwashed by the fact of the big blue book is the only book you need. It's absolutely not.
We actually focus on this book way too much.
Yeah, we do.
It's all we pay attention to. We announce editions and versions, and we judge people's ability on their knowledge and their validation of this book,
Yep.
which is completely.
So I've spoken
ridiculous.
to very, very senior people in our industry and said to them that if somebody comes onto a railway, for instance, and says, I work 7671, my initial thoughts are, then you need to leave, because you're not working to the intent of the full suite of all the guidance and standards that are out there. You're not controlling and managing all the hazards that aren't covered by BS 7671. And for those case in point who are listening, just to give you one example, when you connect an earth bond onto a railway to 7671, that's fantastic and great. The trouble is what you're bonding is also connected to the HV return of a traction system. So it then becomes part of the HV system. You have a bigger problem. I'll do a separate podcast on all this another day.
It's the same though with it's the same with standards that aren't even in the scope of 7671, like 62305. So I've done some training again with Dane recently, and after discussions we had on our own podcast, we talked more about the risk of electricians installing lighting just outside of the lightning protection zone, but not knowing what distance they get from the property till they're outside of that lightning protection zone. You know, we don't know about how to assess those risks. We don't know how to carry out the risk assessments within 62305. But over voltage protection is a fundamental principle, 7671.
Yeah, it's quite scary, actually. You mentioned that, Dave, because after I did our podcast with Dane, the guys from Dane, I looked at some of the car parks that I've got. They're quite large, no lightning protection on them whatsoever.
No, so I had this chat.
Sorry.
There's a need for electricians not to know how to install lightning protection systems, but to know the technical requirements of 62305, what risk assessment decisions are made, so that when they work within a property, it could be a small home, it could be a large manor house, it could be a commercial structure, it doesn't matter. They can immediately identify the presence or absence of lightning protection. They can seek the information from a risk assessment if one is currently valid or has not been done, and they can then potentially look at what assessment risk was done, so they could determine where the boundaries are. Because if they take equipment in or out of those boundaries, they're failing 62305 and they're creating potential dangers of fire and ignition. You know, and then they may put plant on the rooftop and connect it to the common bonding network or the common bonding earth system, which, you know, and then if they go right, maintain that on a stormy day, your solar panels, then you're going to have a huge risk.
So for those who have fallen asleep during that little bit or become completely overwhelmed by the technical stuff that Dave said, my interpretation of what Dave has just said is as follows. When you are selecting and erecting an installation, you are trying to control and manage risk in the use and operation of it. If you do not have all of the available facts, i.e. you're only working 7671, then you're working with an unknown risk that you can't manage. If you then throw into that bucket the duration and use of the installation, i.e. temporary or permanent, permanent is what most people have in their brains. This is where temporary becomes an unknown element, an uncontrollable element, an unmanageable element. It then gets far more complex, and 7909 just kind of maybe covers it with specifics. The old wiring rules, as John has just said, in the 30s covered it very, very well. But 7671 today, and this is what frustrates me, there is currently no limit in 7671. So everyone listening to this is going to go, it doesn't really define it in the regs. It doesn't. 7671 does not define the word temporary, which is really a nuisance. Because I don't understand why they changed it, to be honest with you. But there is no limit as to how an electrical installation should remain in operation. But what they do infer in 7671 is that the designer must consider the possibility of how long it will remain in operation and the fixed use and the external influences and all the rest of it. So 7671 doesn't really care about the duration. It's the installation is the installation. And this is why the word temporary nowadays is quite dangerous, because in a lot of temps we've seen, the level of safety may not be as if it was a permanent installation. I won't allow a temporary installation that doesn't afford a level of protection and quality that isn't a fixed installation. I just won't, especially for my job on a railway with the members of the public and all the rest of it.
And let's bear in mind that even in the 7909, if you're going to use pre-tested equipment, these leads aren't twin and earth cables. These are HO5s, HO7s. These are pretty tough cables manufactured for the temporary event industry. You know, I've seen tennis tournaments and all sorts of others where electricians have wired up bars and stuff temporary for a 2-week or 1-week tournament, but they'll be putting in twin and earth, and then they'll be going underneath and on the grass and underneath the little wooden struts. And these are structures which, as you walk on them, there's lots of movement. There's lots of potential crushing, and they'll just put twin and earth underneath them when they just do a quick temporary. You know.
Yeah, this thing about temporary is there's this sort of illusion that temporary things don't matter and it's only going to be there for a week, so you can just do a shoddy job, which of course is totally untrue. Same standards apply to everything, and if you're going to do something temporarily, it needs to be just as good and put in properly as anything that's going to be there for permanently.
It'll never happen to me. That's the phrase, that's the mindset, that's the behaviour. It'll never happen to me. That's the poor man's risk assessment. It'll never happen to me until you then get a viral video of something blowing up in your face or something, heaven forbid, worse happening. And then you imagine those poor sods in some of those YouTube videos of accidents and incidents. They have no defence in the court of law, because the judge will go after their employers. They'll probably give them a slap around the wrist as well if they survive. Just on temporary. So I'm gonna throw a bit of controversy in there. Don't worry about it, lads. We can put an RCD on it. Your silence is deafening.
Yeah, well, I mean, RCDs are obviously important and useful, but RCDs are not a substitute for doing it properly in the first place. So you can't say, oh, this is some lash up here, so stick an RCD on it all as well, because that's not how RCDs work. Apart of the fact there's plenty of faults which RCDs won't detect anyway. So they're not some kind of magical device that makes everything better.
But they were marketed as a magical device, John. They prevented fires when they first came out, when they were supplementary protection.
Yes.
And obviously AFDD's taken that throne.
Well, there are a number of things. I mean, again, as I said earlier, even short circuit currents can become a problem. With events, you have very long runs for cables. Sometimes the impedances are so long that the fault currents are insufficient to operate the devices, so you may end up with cables overheating. You can have issues with harmonic currents pushing cables up. With you can have variation of loads for the duration of events. Some events, I've been to Dubai where there have been events that run for the whole of the summer for their national one of their national like theme characters. And we went around halfway through an event, and there were panels, covers missing, there were boards off, there were like hoop shoot games where if you threw it over the back of the game and you were a child and you went to recover your board to get your go again, you'd have to step over cables and mind an open panel with live parts. It's the management of events, because something is temporary doesn't mean you don't have to manage it. And if you manage it properly, then a lot of stuff that happens just shouldn't be there. Most of the time, the problem is that the temporary events are not managed. They're properly erected, maybe not. But once the event starts to take action, the heating's going on, the people are walking around. Sometimes in an event, after the first, let's say you've got an event that runs for a few days, you may have people on a stall who pay a premium, and then 2 or 3 days in, they go, oh, it's dead here. We'll move. We'll go away. We'll go on our holiday, whatever. They'll then reject and they'll leave their pitch, and then others will start to move around. This is all stuff I saw when we'd run them. You put a supply in, and then you go in the next day, people have moved about. But their demands change, their requirements change, and you end up having to try and play catch up. It's very hard to control it, you know. Then you have obviously dodgy loads. You have dodgy caterers, and you have dodgy electronics. Then there's the absence of over voltage, which I'm hearing shouldn't be a problem next year, but there's an absence of over voltage protection right now in 7909. So yeah, there's lots of improvement needed. As for if we need to say 3 months, I think we do, because remember, it's not just about 7909. It could be anyone who's just doing a temporary supply for another purpose. But if you have like a period of something like 3 months, you know you've got a time where you need to come back and reassess it. The only thing I think would excuse it is if you had a separate strategy that constantly managed it. If you had a management strategy instead, maybe. If you haven't got a management strategy, then you should put an expiry date on these installations.
Yeah, that's a dangerous term. Management strategy when the managers are incompetent is an incredibly dangerous term. I have had conversations similar to that in previous employment, and when I say you have to have management control strategy, they go, yeah, but we've got a 24/7 maintainer. That's not a management strategy. That's reactive.
Well, obviously the management would be competent, wouldn't it? It'd have to be competent.
Yeah. Have you seen a lot of the client bases in the UK? That at the end of the day, you know, a lot of electrical contractors don't work for competent clients. Excuse me. I've been told by many a contractor, "Oh, we don't normally work for clients that are in smart," and I'm like, okay, I don't know if to take that as a compliment or not, but I can't mitigate for the other clients. All I do know is on rail, we're very lucky in our sector that, you know, a lot of the clients in rail are very competent and intelligent and know what they want, although I'm sure some people listening who work in rail are probably going, not mine. I can't help you there really. Interestingly, back on the RCD, 7909 was obviously the first one to talk about type A, some sort of level from DC immunity, well, give a DC immunity in some form, which was good because 7671's only just got around to getting his finger out of his backside on it.
Yeah, the current edition of it is 2011, and it was definitely in there.
Yes.
It said that ACRCDs just shouldn't be here.
Yep, which I think none of us disagree with in any way, shape or form. RCDs, though, there has been this, I'm going to say 1,167 ohms. This is where John's going to go on a tirade now and say, don't be stupid, Paul, you're just being foolish. Don't be an idiot. There has been the myth propagated that 1,667 ohms, if you get that on your circuit, you're good to go, which is beyond a false economy, but for at least 10 years was propagated as long as it's 1,667, you're fine. But that didn't guarantee any overcurrent protection for that circuit whatsoever. All that did was basically say, the manufacturer saying, if it's below that, the earth leakage will work. If it's an earth leakage fault, if it's a short circuit fault,
yeah, that only supports the chapter 41, one part of the fundamental principles, and only the absence of basic and full protection. It doesn't cover many other areas of the book. It even says that in the book, though.
What's your view on it, John? What do you think of the 1,667?
Well, 1,667, and for those that don't know, it comes from the 50 volts and divided by the current, which is 30 milliamps, which is 1667. In theory, that would trip the RCD and keep the voltage down to 50 volts, but that's only in theory. That's in a fictional world of exactly nice and perfect and all that. So in reality,
you mean that's maths?
Yeah, that's what it is.
So if we're in Hogwarts, we've got a chance it might work.
Yeah, but in reality, forget it, because even if you got that on a system, what if it goes up by 1 ohm when you're not there because the soil dried out a bit? Well, it's not going to work now. It's completely pointless. So in reality, forget it. It's not 60, 67. Think 100 or less, basically, for your sort of electrodes. And on top of that, like I said, RCDs don't work for overcurrent, so completely useless. Doesn't matter if you've got one or not, and it doesn't matter whether it's 60, 67 or any other value. And they're not going to work for a whole load of other problems as well. So, yeah, if you've got a very specific fault between line conductor and the earth, or someone's grabbed onto it, and it happens to be less than that, fine. But all those other things like overheating cables and short circuits and all the rest of it, RCDs are going to be totally useless.
And yet we're mandating them pretty much everywhere now. And as each edition comes, there's more and more reliance on RCDs, but more equipment that leaks.
Yeah.
Confusion reigns supreme.
And this is not our podcast on RCDs, everybody. By the way,
This is not our podcast. This could be derived as a preview to our podcast on RCDs, but the RCD one we're going to need to reserve an entire day for and do an 8-hour session and then just edit it into about 3 or 4 hours worth. So, because that is a whole different one. So one other thing with temporaries as well. So I'm putting on my Paul Skirm hat and I'm immediately saying, no. So CE marking products, temporaries, 7909. The minute you take something and put it together with something else, you form a system. When parts are interconnected, it becomes part of a system. How do you guarantee the compliance of all the various components as part of a bigger system? I would suggest as a temporary installation, you're going to struggle, which is why I'm not a fan of the word just temp. I am a big fan of a installation of a temporary duration, not just it's a temp. Dave, you're looking at a device incredibly intently.
Sorry, mate.
For those listening into podcasting world.
Sorry, yeah. I was just trying to look at this AFDD. I was wondering if the nominal voltage actually impacts the operation characteristics of the RCDs.
Depends on. Well, it might.
And then I was wondering, well, that kind of impedance of 1667 probably wouldn't give you the right voltages, so you may even have a bigger problem. Anyway, sorry, I digress.
Stop it.
Sorry, I'll put that down.
Stop giving previews to people.
No, going back to what you're saying. Yes, the event industry, often you get distros put all together, and I think there's a couple that put CE marks on some of their stuff. But a lot of the stuff is made ad hoc, on the go, on the fly. And no, there'll be nothing for that.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be just made up on not like that, because it should all be marked either with CE or UKCA as it is now. And the central point about that is that if you buy a product, if you buy some different products that are all CE marked or UKCA marked, if you stick all those products together, it doesn't mean that the end result is going to be compliant with any of those directives, because it's how they're put together that matters. And this comes up in a whole load of different things, that as well, and also things like electric gate installations is a good one for that. So if you buy all like the motors and the sensors and all the stuff, they can all be marked individually as CE marked and UKCA marked, but the way they're put together is what matters. So if you install a set of electric gates, you have to then declare that is a whole is compliant with all the directives, and that is down to the installer. And it's not just a case of saying, oh, all the products have got a label on, so therefore everything's fine, because that's not how it works at all. So
I guess it's a bit like baking a cake. You can buy all the right ingredients that are health checked and made and graded, but you put the wrong things together, it still ends up with a pile of shit, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that's it.
There you go. So temporary installations are a temporary cake that could taste crap. That's a nice analogy for you. But I was going to add to John's chapter 33, compatibility of the installation, maintainability. This is stuff that doesn't strike when we see some of the horror attempts. Safety services, continuity services. Just chapter 3 alone, one of the most ignored parts of 7671. When you do the word temporary, you kind of just forget chapter 3 even exists. I'm suggesting you should.
Yeah. Again, let's just make sure we've added into this that if you're putting in any installation, temporary or permanent, even temporaries still have to comply 100% with the requirements of the legislations and all the other things. It don't matter, it's temporary in anything. That can bite you on the backside later on.
Yeah.
I agree. People need to think about that. If it's only for the weekend, or even if it's only for overnight, if you don't know the environment, you don't know the control mechanisms, you don't know it's going to be operated safely, you've got to up it, you've got to improve it, you've got to protect it, you've got to stay with it, or you've got to not install it. That
was quite pertinent, actually. That's very good.
Sorry.
No. That was really good. And for those listening, we will do another podcast with Mr. Skirm on directives and that hierarchy of directives. Might be worth a webinar as well. I don't know yet, but I do think we should do something that covers that huge field of standards and legislation, and because people will hear the word directive, they'll hear the word CE mark, UK CA mark, and they'll where does a BS sit with a BSEN, a HD, an IEC, and
Yeah,
probably
you've
worth
just
explaining that in a future
you
one.
kind of just touched on it there by saying the huge field. That is the problem. It's something that we would have to find a way to kind of deliver in a way that everyone can then cross everything off and check everything.
Weirdly enough, I've actually created a whole load of hierarchy triangles for like fire, for electrical at work, because what I'm doing is in my tender documents, I'm telling the contractors how I see the legislation all the way from Europe, all the way down to the guy with the screwdriver in his hand, so that it can educate the contractor reading the tender document, which I'm quite pleased with, because
Yeah.
I know what'll end up happening if I don't say I explained it very clearly. And also the people reading the tender docs should be able to learn something from the tender docs as well. So an interpretation. So I've been doing all fancy diagrams and bits and bobs, so it's not impossible for us to maybe do a webinar or podcast on that where we can put some pictures on the screen. Other than that, straw poll chaps, temporaries.
Yeah.
If we were going to summarize, Dave, I'll start with you. What's your view on temporaries?
There should definitely be a planned life of a temporary. It should be in all the documentation, and it will be planned to be installed for this duration of time, and that time will have a life. 3 months sounds fine. Obviously, with consideration of the type of installation, if it is a little bit more questionable, it may need to be shortened. That's the whole point of frequencies. Anything longer than 3 months, yeah, I would say no. I would want to come and do another inspection and kind of approve it for another 3 months or so forth. I like the idea of trying to manage systems, so that's what I do for a part of my work. And I do appreciate that, Paul, that many people who think contractors, or many clients that will have management systems, they don't work as effectively. It's the thing with temporaries is that there's such a vast variety of types of arrangements of installations, and there's not one solution to fix all of them. But it must be planned, and it must be installed, and it must be suitable relative to all influences it's subjected to, and that even if they change, and if they are going to change, maybe persons need to occupy the installation for the duration of the event to make those decisions quicker.
And Mr. Ward.
Yeah, temporary. I'll just say that temporary installations are not some kind of lash up. In most cases, temporary installations require a ton more work than permanent ones. So temporary is not some sort of quick and easy and cheap way of just doing something quickly. All the same stuff applies, and in many cases a big pile of other stuff as well. So don't think it's just some kind of quick and easy and simple way of doing it, and do not think that RCDs are some kind of thing you can just slap on as a sticking plaster fix to make it all better, because it doesn't work. So
no, we've got AFDDs now to do that.
Oh God.
So can I confess now? I am guilty of lash-ups in my career. I am guilty of temporary lash-ups in my career, and the reason I'm guilty of them is because I didn't know any better, and I now know that isn't much of a defence either. But just to give kind of a context of, yes, this weekend I've seen some 7909 stuff done terribly. A couple of months ago I was on a film set, and the entire movie was being lit in this wonderful, it was a fight like club type scene, and there was about 190 meters worth of Tesco purchased extension leads plugged in with Tesco bags wrapped around the extension lead while it was raining to run some big panel lights for the film guys. And I was like, oh my God, I looked at this and I was like, oh, the volt drop's going to be off the charts. It was literally nearly 200 meters. And when I went in and I said to the guy, I said, how are these lights even working? He said, oh, they're from China, and the voltage range is like 140 to 240. And I was just like, oh, right, that's how you get away with it. I went, yeah, these are the ones where they get really hot, and don't touch them because occasionally you might get a belt off of them. And I'm like, wow, okay. So there's sometimes things aren't managed and aren't controlled. For those listening, before we wind this down, I'm just going to add a little note on temporaries versus permanent. The electrical installation certificate. There is a box called extent of the installation covered by the certificate. That is where you keep yourself out of prison if you are selecting and erecting based on a defined scope as a contractor, and you need to advise the client accordingly. Comments on the existing installation. If there isn't one there because you've installed it, you should say, there must be control measures, maintenance, inspection, etc. This is only designed for 3 months. If it's installed longer than 3 months, because as we said, something was very successful, then cover yourself by telling them, right, if this is going to be in more than 3 months, you need to have us back. We need to be checking it, pat testing it, controlling it, doing whatever we need to do, or changing the loads, etc. So indemnify yourself. It doesn't have to be a novel. You may not be able to get all the information. The client may be as thick as 2 planks. That's fine. Just create some generic exemption clauses. In fact, you know what we'll do? We might do a podcast where we just go through how contractors can better protect themselves.
Yeah, I mean, you can even just try and simplify the terminology as best we can. For example, you could say to a client, this is for it is as it is now. If you plug anything else in, then we need to look into it again. I mean, that's, you know, that kind of message will tell a client not to get in a new food wagon, not to get in a new system, not to add, you know, double up on refrigerators or walk-in fridges for a bar, unless they then tell the Spark that, just gets indemnity out of it. But just, you need to just, I think another podcast just to kind of how to better, or how to simply talk to clients and get clients educated would be good.
Yeah, we can do that. We can do that. That's easy because my brain's already in overdrive of different stuff. So I've just kind of wound my brain up late on a very night, whatever tonight is. Okay, final thoughts, lads, and then we'll wind it.
I'm looking forward to next year sometime when 7909 gets an update. I'm not anticipating all the changes I'd like to happen, but I'm hoping to use it as a good work piece to hopefully then spread the message out more about the importance of properly designing, installing, testing, commissioning, certifying temporary events, temporary systems generally, if anything. A lot of people need to think of 7909 just not as only for event industry, although that's clearly where it's kind of leaning. But again, as we said earlier on, if you're working, if you go to a shop and you see Christmas display lighting out like that, it's not a festival, it's not a concert, it's a event that the public are occupying. It's a space. It must be safely installed, safely controlled, safely maintained and tested. Lots of potential for Sparks, to be fair.
Yeah, it's work, isn't it? It's money. At the end of the day, it's profit, it's money, and it's keeping people and their families safe, which is only a wonderful thing. Indeed. John, final thoughts, mate?
Yeah, I'll just say, if you want to see a load of junk and horrendously temporary installations coming up over the Christmas period, garden centres, that's a good place to go, and you see some horrendous stuff there. So if you're in them over the Christmas period, just see what kind of electrical stuff they've got and see if that complies with anything. Because
take a picture and send it to Paul on Instagram, and we'll put that fatally the festive floors hashtag going. Try and raise awareness.
And if you'd like to meet John Ward this Christmas, he will be in all of the B&Qs and garden centres in Dorset, taking pictures of some horrific installations. That's it. I think we'll end it here. There's plenty more we can cover on this, and I think 709 Revised will be a good debate stimulator to get people's awareness up on it. So other than that, thanks chaps for joining me as always, and to those listening, thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for watching. Please leave your comments below or message us on Instagram or one of the lads on their platforms, and until next one, take care of yourself and each other. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
That weren't bad for Winged, was it really?
No.
That weren't bad for Winged.